The night the water came, they didn't call the HOA president first, they called me. My phone lit up with panicked messages. The river is in my yard. My basement is filling. Do you have sandbags? I stood on my porch listening to the roar in the dark. And all I could think was one bitter sentence. This is exactly what I warned them would happen. Only 3 weeks earlier, those same neighbors had clapped while the HOA handed me a violation notice and demanded I tear down the small dam I built on my own land. They said it was against community rules. They said I was avoiding fees. They said I was selfish. Now the river was rising like it had been waiting for permission. My name is Daniel, and I moved to Maple Glen because it looked peaceful. The brochure showed smiling families, neat sidewalks, and a gentle river that curled behind the neighborhood like a ribbon. The realtor called it a water feature. What she didn't say was that the river also had a temper. Older residents quietly mentioned it used to flood before the area was developed, back when it was mostly woods and fields. The builders fixed that problem, they claimed, with drainage ditches and a concrete channel. Everyone trusted the plan. Everyone except me, because my property backed up to the river. And I could see signs the water still wanted its space. I'm not an engineer. But I grew up on my grandfather's farm, where water management was a daily habit. He taught me one rule: you don't fight water, you guide it. If you block it with arrogance, it finds a new path. If you give it a place to slow down, it behaves. When I bought my home, I noticed the bank behind my yard was already eroding, and the current was faster than it looked. After heavy rain, the river ran high and brown, carrying branches and trash. And I noticed something else. The neighborhood storm drains emptied straight toward my side of the river like everything was being pushed into the same narrow throat. Behind my fence was a strip of land that belonged to me, nothing fancy. Just brush, a few trees, and a shallow bend where water naturally pooled during storms. I walked it one afternoon and found old stones stacked in a line, half buried in mud. It looked like someone long ago had tried to slow the flow. That gave me an idea. Not a giant structure, not some Hollywood wall of concrete, just a small retention dam made of stones, logs, and reinforced mesh to create a shallow pond during storms. The point wasn't to hold back the river forever. The point was to slow it down so it wouldn't surge through the neighborhood like a battering ram before I touched a single rock. I did what responsible people do. I asked questions. I called the county office. I talked to a clerk who transferred me to Water Resources. They told me the area was not a protected wetland, but anything altering flow still needed a review. I filed paperwork. A local inspector came out, looked at the bend, and said, "If you keep it low and include an overflow channel, it can actually reduce downstream flooding." He gave me a list of requirements: height limits, safe materials, and a spillway so water could pass without pressure building. I followed everything because I didn't want a project, I wanted peace. Building it took me 2 weekends. I worked with hand tools and a rented compactor. I placed stones in a wide arc, secured them with wire mesh, and left a shallow V-shaped spillway in the center. Behind it, the water created a calm pond about the size of a small backyard pool, maybe knee-deep in the deepest part. It looked natural, like it belonged there. Birds started coming. Frogs appeared. Even the water looked cleaner because sediment settled instead of racing downstream. And during the first big rain after I finished, I watched the pond rise, fill, and then release slowly through the spillway. Downriver, the level stayed lower than usual. I felt proud not because I won, but because it worked. At first, neighbors loved it. Kids asked if they could look at the tadpoles. Dog walkers stopped by my fence to chat. One man told me, "That little pond makes this feel like a park." I never advertised it. I never asked for applause. I just kept it maintained, cleared debris after storms, and checked the spillway like my grandfather would have. The dam was low enough to step over, and it was set far back from the main channel so it didn't block fish or trap animals. It was simple, quiet, and effective. Which is why I was shocked when the HOA started acting like I'd built a fortress. The Maple Glen HOA was run by a tight group who treated the neighborhood like their personal kingdom. The president, Linda Shaw, was famous for measuring grass with a ruler and leaving warning stickers on trash cans. She smiled in public, but her eyes always looked like she was counting your mistakes. A month after my dam was built, I got a letter titled Notice of Violation. It said I had constructed an unauthorized structure and altered a community waterway. It demanded I remove it within 10 days or face daily fines. I stared at the paper like it was written in another language. The river behind my yard wasn't HOA property. The dam was on my land, and I had county approval. I requested a meeting. At the HOA office, Linda and 2 board members sat behind a table like judges. I brought my county permit, photos, and a short explanation of what the dam did. Linda didn't even pick up my paperwork. She said, "You changed the appearance of the water area." The community didn't vote on that. I told her the pond was behind my fence, not a public feature. She leaned forward and said, "The river affects all residents, so it's our business." Then she hit me with a line that felt personal. "Also, you're behind on HOA fees." This is not the time to challenge the board. That's when I realized the dam wasn't the real issue. Control was not about the HOA fees. I was behind, but not because I was trying to dodge anything. The HOA had increased dues with almost no notice. And I was disputing a charge for landscaping improvements that never happened on my street. I had emails, photos, and receipts. I told them I was willing to pay the base dues, but not mystery fees. Linda acted like that was a confession. "Non-payment is non-payment," she said, "and the dam must go." I offered a compromise. I'd put up a safety sign. I'd provide my permit copies, and I'd even let a neutral inspector review it. They refused. The board voted right there to fine me. Over the next week, the letters kept coming. Fines stacked up like bricks, $50 a day, then administrative processing fees, then legal review fees. One letter hinted at a lien against my house. I called a lawyer, and he sighed like he'd heard this story too many times. He said, "You can fight, but it will cost you time and money. HOA rules are messy, even when you're right." I kept thinking, why are they obsessed with this little dam? Then a neighbor told me the truth at a mailbox cluster. Linda wanted the riverbank opened up. It's for a community walking path idea. My pond made it look private. I tried talking to neighbors directly. I went door to door with calm facts. The dam reduced erosion, slowed storm surges, and had an overflow channel. Some listened. Some shrugged. A few said, "If the HOA says it's illegal, just remove it." People didn't want conflict. They wanted normal. But normal was already fragile, and the river didn't care about neighborhood politics. I asked them to attend the next HOA meeting because I knew the board counted on empty chairs. A few promised they would. Most avoided my eyes. And in the background, Linda's circle whispered the same phrase. "He built it to avoid paying fees." That rumor spread faster than floodwater. At the next HOA meeting, the room smelled like coffee and tension. I stood at the microphone with my paperwork. Linda smiled politely and said, "Please keep comments under 2 minutes." I explained the permit, the spillway, and the flood reduction. I even showed before and after photos of the eroding bank. A couple of people nodded. Then Linda spoke like she was reading from a script. "The board's position is that any modification of waterways must be approved by the HOA to ensure uniform appearance and liability control." Someone behind her added, "And he's delinquent." That word delinquent hung in the air like a stain. The vote passed. Remove the dam or face legal action. I went home angry, but anger doesn't stop paperwork. A week later, a certified letter arrived from the HOA's attorney. It was the kind of letter that doesn't just threaten, it predicts. It said they would seek an injunction and recover costs. My lawyer told me I had a strong case, but a slow one. I imagined months of hearings while fines grew. I imagined my credit ruined and my house tied up in a legal knot. I wasn't scared of being wrong. I was tired of being crushed by a system designed to exhaust you. So I made the decision that felt like swallowing glass. I would remove the dam, at least for now. The morning I took it apart, the sky was bright and unfairly blue. I stood in the shallow water with gloves on, pulling out stones I had placed so carefully. The pond drained away like it was exhaling its last breath. Birds scattered. The water rushed through the bend faster, louder, impatient. It was like watching a calm animal turn wild. My neighbor Mark watched from his deck. He didn't say much, just, "This is ridiculous." But he didn't come help either. By afternoon, the dam was gone. The river was back to its straight, narrow speedway, aimed directly toward the downstream section where the newest houses sat. Houses built lower than the older ones because developers loved cutting costs more than respecting nature. A few days later, Linda sent a final letter. Violation resolved. Fees remain outstanding. No apology. No acknowledgement of my permit. Just a cold stamp of authority. I paid the base dues to stop the bleeding and continued disputing the extra charges. But the bigger problem sat behind my backyard like a loaded question. Without the dam, the bank started crumbling again. After small rains, the river rose quickly and fell quickly, like a temper tantrum. I started keeping a notebook of water levels, taking photos after storms, emailing the HOA with concerns. I was trying to create a record knot out of revenge, but because I could feel something coming. Then the forecast changed. A weather system stalled over our county, and meteorologists started using words that make you sit up straight. Training storms. Saturated ground, flash flood risk. The first day of rain was steady but manageable. The second day, it got heavier, and the river turned the color of chocolate milk. By the third day, it was no longer just rain, it was a curtain, thick and relentless, pounding rooftops like 1,000 fists. At midnight, I stepped outside with a flashlight. The river had climbed the bank and was chewing at the soil where my dam used to slow it down. The sound was deep and angry. At 2:17 a.m., my power flickered. At 2:24, it went out. I stared through my window at darkness and rain so thick it erased the world. That's when my phone started buzzing. First one message, then 10, then a flood of them. "Daniel, the street is underwater. My garage is flooding. The storm drain is shooting water." I put on boots and grabbed my old emergency kit. I ran to the back fence and shined my light. The river had jumped its channel. It wasn't just rising, it was charging downstream. And now it had no slow pool, no retention bend, nothing to bleed off energy. Just speed. I drove carefully toward the lower part of Maple Glen where the newest homes were. The streets looked like shallow rivers, water pouring over curbs and swirling around mailboxes. I saw trash bins floating like little boats. In the headlights, I caught sight of Linda's prized flower beds completely submerged. And then I saw the worst. Water pushing into driveways, climbing front steps, slipping under garage doors. People stood on porches holding phones with trembling hands. A man yelled, "Call 911." Another shouted, "They're not answering." The storm drains were overwhelmed, blasting water back up like fountains. Everything the developers promised would handle runoff was failing at once. I stopped by Mark's house first because I knew he had an elderly mother living with him. Water was already ankle-deep in his living room. We carried his mother to my car, wrapped in blankets, while rain slapped our faces. Mark's voice cracked when he said, "I should have spoken up." We drove her to the community center on higher ground, where a few families were gathering with pets and backpacks. People looked at each other with wide eyes, like they'd just realized nature doesn't care about property values. Outside, sirens wailed, but they sounded far away and stretched thin. The county was dealing with flooding everywhere, not just our little neighborhood, by dawn. The river had done what it always wanted to do: reclaim the low land. Several homes near the downstream bend had 2 to 3 feet of water inside. Cars were half submerged. A wooden fence had collapsed and floated sideways like a broken spine. When the rain finally eased, the damage became clearer and crueler. Mud coated everything. People stood in silence, staring at ruined furniture through open garage doors. And then, like a spark finding gasoline, someone said loudly, "If Daniel's dam was still there, maybe this wouldn't have happened." Heads turned. The sentence spread in murmurs. I didn't say a word. I just helped carry soaked boxes to the curb and handed out bottled water. Later that morning, Linda appeared in rain boots, stepping carefully as if mud offended her. She looked shocked, but not humble. She moved from group to group, saying, "We will investigate. We will hold the responsible parties accountable." When she reached me, her eyes sharpened. "This is exactly why unapproved structures are dangerous," she said, loud enough for people to hear. I stared at her, tired and wet and furious. "My structure wasn't dangerous," I replied. "It was a retention dam with a spillway and a county review. You forced me to remove it." Linda's jaw tightened. "This flood is an act of God," she said. "Don't make this about you." But the water in people's homes made it about all of us. 2 days later, inspectors arrived, county engineers, insurance adjusters, and a few news crews chasing dramatic footage. A county engineer named Ms. Alvarez knocked on my door because she had my name from old permit records. She asked calm, direct questions: where the dam was, how high it was, what materials I used, and when it was removed. I showed her photos and the original approval notes. She walked to the bend behind my yard and studied the erosion scar where the dam had been. She didn't accuse me. She didn't praise me. She just said, "This area acts like a natural detention point. Without anything slowing flow, peak velocity increases downstream." Then she looked toward the damaged homes and added, "And downstream, they built too low." The HOA, of course, held an emergency meeting. This time, the room was packed. People who never showed up before were sitting in folding chairs, arms crossed, faces tight. Linda tried to open with her usual polished tone, but it cracked under pressure. Homeowners demanded answers. Why were drains failing? Why weren't retention basins bigger? Why did the HOA focus on paint colors while ignoring flood risk? Someone shouted, "You fine Daniel for protecting us." Linda banged a gavel and said, "Order." But the crowd didn't shrink. For the first time, Maple Glen looked less like a polite brochure and more like a real community angry. Scared and finally awake, when it was my turn to speak, I didn't come with revenge. I came with facts. I showed the timeline, my permit request, the inspector visit, the dam design with an overflow channel, and the HOA letters demanding removal. I explained in simple terms. Slowing water reduces peak flow downstream, like easing traffic instead of releasing every car at once. I said my dam wasn't a miracle wall, but it was a speed bump. And you don't remove speed bumps right before a school zone. A few people nodded hard. Others looked sick, like they'd just realized they'd trusted the wrong voices. Linda kept repeating the word liability, but the room no longer accepted it as magic. Within a week, the story hit local social media. Not the version Linda wanted on HOA, heroically enforcing rules, but the version people couldn't stop sharing. A homeowner built a permitted flood control feature. Got bullied by the HOA over fees, removed it. And then the neighborhood flooded. Comments exploded. Some were cruel. Some were supportive. But the pressure forced transparency. Homeowners started requesting HOA records, budget reports, legal expenses, engineering plans from the original development. And buried in those documents was something ugly years earlier. An engineer had recommended a larger stormwater retention pond for Maple Glen. The developer had reduced it to save money. And the HOA had never pushed to fix it. That discovery changed everything. Now, the flood wasn't just bad luck. It was the result of decisions, cheap ones. A group of homeowners formed an action committee. Mark joined. 2 retired accountants joined. A woman whose basement flooded joined, still smelling like damp drywall. They invited me, too. I hesitated because I didn't want to be the damn guy forever. But I also didn't want the truth to drown in politics again. So I agreed, on one condition: we focus on solutions, not just blame. People were already hurting. They needed repairs, yes. But they also needed reassurance that this wouldn't happen again. The HOA tried to regain control by hiring their own consultant, who arrived with a fancy jacket and vague words. He told the board, extreme weather events are increasing. True. Then he implied there was nothing anyone could do beyond community awareness. That was not enough. Ms. Alvarez from the county returned with a more honest report. Maple Glen's drainage system was undersized. The river channel had been constrained, and the low-lying lots were vulnerable. She also noted something that made the room go quiet. Small upstream retention features, like the one I hid, could reduce peak flow if designed correctly and coordinated with proper basins. In other words, my little dam wasn't the villain. It was a missing piece. Linda still wouldn't admit fault. She kept pointing to the HOA bylaws, repeating, rules are rules, but rules aren't shields when they cause harm. Several homeowners who had suffered major damage spoke up with shaking voices. One man said, I lost my furnace, my water heater, and my kid's bedroom carpet. And you were busy sending Daniel fines. A woman added, my insurance is fighting me because it's flood damage, not water damage. When Linda tried to interrupt, people didn't let her. The mood had shifted from polite frustration to something sharper: accountability. For the first time, the board members beside Linda looked uncomfortable, like they realized they'd followed her off a cliff. Then came the lawsuits, not against me, like Linda hinted, but against the HOA and the developer. Insurance companies started asking questions too, because they don't like paying for preventable disasters. Homeowners demanded a full audit. Under that spotlight, the HOA's spending looked embarrassing. Thousands on legal letters, landscaping enhancements for entrance signs, and enforcement campaigns, but almost nothing on drainage upgrades. When the committee asked why, the treasurer admitted they'd been afraid to raise dues for infrastructure because it was unpopular. Instead, they focused on small fines and appearance issues to make up budget gaps. In simple terms, they squeezed residents instead of fixing the real problem. A month after the flood, the riverbank behind my yard was a torn-up mess. The county temporarily placed sandbags and straw wattles to prevent more erosion. Neighbors walked by like the area had become a memorial. One afternoon, Mark approached me with a quiet look. I'm sorry, he said. I saw what you were trying to do. I just didn't want to be on the HOA's bad side. I nodded because I understood. Fear makes people silent. He glanced at the river and asked, could you rebuild it? I took a breath. Not the same way, I said. Not without a community plan. If we do this, we do it right. with full approval and proper engineering. For once, someone else was ready to say yes. The committee worked with the county to propose a real solution: a professionally engineered retention basin upstream, improvements to storm drains, and a restored natural floodplain area in the bend behind my property, meaning space where water could spread safely without invading homes. It wasn't cheap, but it was cheaper than another flood. The plan also included a smaller, reinforced weir structure at my bend, basically a safer, regulated version of my dam concept with maintenance schedules and inspections. The difference now was that it would be transparent and shared, not treated like a personal rebellion. People who once avoided meetings were now reading reports and asking smart questions. Disaster had educated everyone fast. At the next HOA election, the community center was packed again, this time with ballots. Linda ran for re-election like nothing had happened. She said she had experience and promised to keep property values stable. But stability isn't just pretty lawns, it's dry living rooms. The committee nominated 3 new candidates: Mark, the retired accountant, and a civil engineer who lived on the far side of Maple Glen and had been warning about drainage for years. I didn't run, but I did speak. I said, "This isn't about punishing anyone. It's about learning. We can't enforce our way out of physics." When votes were counted, Linda lost by a landslide. Linda didn't leave quietly. She sent emails claiming the new board was reckless and overreacting. She hinted that I manipulated everyone with my personal project. But her power was gone. And without that power, her words sounded smaller. The new board immediately paused aggressive fine policies and opened the financial books. People were shocked by how much money had been spent on enforcement and attorney letters. The board also settled several disputes, including mine, and removed the extra fees that were never properly documented. It felt strange to receive an email from the HOA that simply said, "Balance corrected. Thank you for your patience." It was the first time in a long time the HOA sounded like a service, not a threat. Construction started in late summer. Heavy equipment rolled in, and for a while, Maple Glen looked like a work zone instead of a postcard. Some residents complained about the noise, but the flood victims reminded them what silence cost. The retention basin was dug deeper and lined with native plants to slow runoff. Storm drains were upgraded, and some pipes were replaced with larger ones. Behind my yard, the county and engineers shaped the bend into a controlled overflow area with rock reinforcement and a design spillway. They installed a low weir structure that looked natural but was built to handle serious flow. Watching it take shape, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. Relief that it would help. Sadness that it took destroyed homes to get here. The first big storm after the upgrades arrived in October. Not as extreme as the flood event, but heavy enough to test the system. Neighbors watched the river like it was a live show. The retention basin filled gradually, holding water back instead of dumping it all at once. The bend behind my yard pooled calmly in the new overflow area, then released through the spillway at a controlled pace. Downstream, the level rose but didn't explode over the banks. No garages flooded, no sirens. People actually slept. The next morning, Mark texted me one word: worked. I stared at the message longer than I expected, feeling something in my chest loosen. It wasn't victory. It was safety. Weeks later, I ran into a woman named Sarah whose home had been badly damaged in the flood. She told me her family was still repairing drywall and replacing furniture, piece by piece. Then she surprised me by saying, "I used to think HOA rules kept us safe. Now I know they can also keep us blind." She asked if I hated the neighborhood. I looked around at the trees, the sidewalks, the river glittering under winter sun. "No," I said. "I just hate what happens when people choose pride over facts." She nodded, then added, "Thank you for helping that night." Even after what they did to you, I didn't know how to respond, so I just said the truth. We live here together. That's bigger than a board. As the months passed, the story turned into a lesson people repeated to new residents. Not as gossip, but as a warning. Pay attention to infrastructure. Ask questions, attend meetings, and don't let loud voices replace reality. The new HOA board started holding quarterly sessions with county experts. They created a maintenance fund strictly for drainage and erosion control. They also rewrote parts of the bylaws so residents could propose improvements without being treated like criminals. The goal wasn't to remove rules. It was to remove weaponized rules, the kind used to punish instead of protect. And for the first time since I moved in, the HOA felt like a community tool rather than a neighborhood trap. Sometimes people ask me if I feel proved right. The honest answer is complicated. I was right about the water, yes. But being right doesn't dry photos or replace a child's ruined toy. I would trade that validation for a quiet week where no one lost anything. What I do feel is a hard-earned respect for how quickly comfort can turn into crisis and how important it is to speak up before disaster. Gives you no choice. My little dam was never meant to embarrass anyone. It was meant to slow a river down. The real flood, I learned, wasn't just water. It was what happens when power goes unchecked and people stay silent to avoid trouble. So if you live in an HOA, or anywhere really, remember this: rules should serve life, not the other way around. Ask where stormwater goes. Ask what happens in a 100-year storm. Ask who benefits when someone gets labeled delinquent instead of being heard. And if someone in your neighborhood is trying responsibly, legally, and transparently to prevent a real danger, don't let petty politics crush them. Because water doesn't care about meetings or letters or fines. Water only follows gravity. And when the rain comes hard enough, the only thing that matters is whether your community built barriers out of ego, built solutions out of common sense.